If your team executed perfectly for the next 4 weeks, would anybody care? If you ran perfect sprints, I mean perfect, every 2 weeks, you're on time, you've got no cards carrying over, you have beautifully clean retros and demos, but nobody on your team had any say in what the company was actually trying to accomplish this year. Would any of that beautiful agile activity matter? I mean, like really matter, not we shipped a lot of content matter, not our utilization and our throughput are really great kind of matter, like actually matter in the way that marketing is supposed to matter, driving the business forward in a measurable way. Now, I'm asking this kind of uncomfortable, icky question because I talk to a lot of marketing leaders who are deeply invested in getting their agile execution right. Ceremonies, cadence, boards, project management tool, prioritization, they want to get it just right. And that is not a bad thing. That investment of time and effort and resources is not misplaced because if you have listened to this podcast at all and have ever talked to me, you know that I strongly believe that execution matters. But there's something in the State of Agile Marketing Report data that keeps coming up year after year. And it's something that I really want to point out more deliberately. And that is that the teams that are getting the most out of their agile practices are not the ones with the cleanest sprints or the prettiest Kanban boards. They're the ones who have used agile to earn a seat at the strategy table and then actually changed how strategy gets made. That is what we're going to dig into in this episode. What it means to graduate from plan executor to plan shaper, and why that gap exists in the first place. And of course, the part that most Agile content sort of skips over, what process changes actually make it possible to go from plan executor to plan shaper. And I'm sorry to say that you cannot sprint your way out of a strategy problem. It's just not going to happen. We have to do more. We have to go deeper and think more critically about how we're using Agile than just hoping that a better sprint is going to fix everything. So let's get going. Welcome to the Agile Marketing Edge, the first podcast dedicated to turning Agile theory into real-world marketing breakthroughs. I'm Andrea Fryrear, CEO of AgileSherpas, and your guide on this climb to smarter, faster, outcome-driven marketing. Every week, we dig into the what, who, and how behind Agile marketing, from building high-velocity workflows and cutting waste to measuring what actually matters and scaling success across teams. So lace up those virtual hiking boots, limit your whip, and hit follow wherever you listen. This episode digs into the strategy and planning section of the 9th annual State of Agile Marketing Report. And I want to make a case that this is the section that is maybe the most worth paying attention to. Not because it has the most dramatic, sexy numbers, but because it gets at the question that should be underneath pretty much every conversation about Agile marketing. What is all of this operational improvement actually for? Let me give you the headline number first, and then I'm going to complicate it. In this year's report, 53% of Agile marketers said their teams help set organizational strategy, not align to it, set it. Compare that to 37% of non-Agile marketers. That is a 16-point gap That is not noise. That is statistically significant numbers. And that's a structural difference in how these teams operate within their organizations. And here's where a lot of people just stop. They read that number and think, Agile teams do better at strategy. Great. More evidence to throw on the Agile is better than not Agile pile. But I want to push on the mechanism here because the mechanism is what I think is actually useful. Why does Agile correlate with strategic influence? The easy answer, which you've probably heard along with me a lot of times, is that Agile teams are more visible. They're more out there. They're shipping things. They're demonstrating results. Leadership notices. Win. And yes, that kind of credibility matters. And I have made that case more than once in this podcast. You can go back to the collaboration episode from a couple of weeks ago and hear me make that case very recently. But I think there's something more specific happening because Agile practices, when they're implemented well, create a feedback loop between work and strategy that non-Agile teams just don't have. When you're doing sprint reviews, when you're doing quarterly planning against outcomes, not outputs, when you're building in the habit of asking, is this still the right thing for us to be working on? You're not just executing better. You're building institutional muscle for strategic thinking. Non-Agile teams generally not doing this. They are writing their annual plan, getting it approved, and then working through it for 12 months, regardless of what the world does. And we all know how that ends. So the 16-point gap isn't really just Agile teams are better at strategy. It's closer to Agile teams have built a system that produces strategic input as a byproduct of their operational rhythm. And that is a very different thing. And it means that the path to strategic influence is not pitching your way into planning meetings. It's changing how your teams work so that strategic thinking is baked into the process itself. Which means we got to talk about protected time. Because there's this one data point in the operations section that I keep coming back to. It is one of those numbers that kind of feels small until you think about what it actually means in real life. 54% of Agile marketers say they regularly get protected time to think strategically. For non-Agile marketers, that number is 29%. Just let that sink in because I want to be honest about what protected time to think strategically actually feels like when you're inside a marketing team. It feels like a luxury to most of us. It sounds like the thing that's going to get cut first when a campaign needs some last minute content, when somebody's out sick, or when the CEO does a flyby and they need a deck for the board meeting by the end of the day. Protected strategic thinking time is the first casualty in every reactive environment. And here's the thing. If half of non-Agile marketers only occasionally or rarely get that time, they're not suddenly going to have better strategic ideas from a bolt of lightning out of the sky. You can't think strategically on the side of your desk. You can't develop a real point of view on where the business should go while you're triaging your inbox and trying to cobble together a deck before the end of the day. And this is where I want to bring in something from outside kind of our usual frame of reference. Teresa Torres, who does a lot of work on product strategy through what she calls continuous discovery, makes the argument that strategic thinking is not a skill that you deploy during a quarterly planning session. It is a habit of ongoing investigation, constantly asking what opportunities exist, testing assumptions about customer needs, building an opportunity tree rather than a static roadmap. And I think this applies directly to marketing. The teams that earn strategic influence are not the ones who come to annual planning meetings with a brilliant, beautiful presentation. They are the ones who've been doing continuous discovery all year long, talking to customers, running small experiments, building a living picture of where the market is moving to. Not even just where it is right now, but where it is going. So when the planning meeting happens, they are not trying to pitch their way in with their beautiful slides because they're the ones with the freshest intelligence. Of course, people want them to be in the room and in the conversation. But you can only have that information and participate in that way if your operating model has protected your time so you can gather that information. If your team is 120% allocated to campaign execution with zero slack, ain't no discovery happening. There is no strategic contribution coming out of a function that runs that way. Your best existence is executing somebody else's strategy, and that's it. But the Agile operating model, if you're doing it right, builds slack into the system on purpose. Your sprints should not be 120% loaded. The retrospective cadence should create regular space to zoom out and talk about what you're learning and what's working. Shorter planning cycles, be it quarterly or monthly, create structured moments to ask whether the work you're doing is still pointing in the right direction and helping your customers in the right way. And it is not a coincidence that protected time is a product of deliberate structural choices. And the gap between 54% and 29% on strategic thinking time is largely explained by those structural choices, not by people's good intentions. Because we all want to be strategic. We all want that protected time. If we could just have it by wanting it, we would all have it. We need the underlying operational infrastructure to give it to us. Otherwise, it's the first thing that gets cut. So here's another number that I want to bring to your attention. 73% of Agile marketers say their daily work clearly connects to strategic goals. For non-Agile marketers, that's 59%. Again, let that ruminate, because 59% is really not terrible on the surface. But if we look at what's underneath it, 14 points worth of marketers who are doing work every day and don't actually know if it connects to strategically important stuff. Those marketers are producing things, campaigns, content, events, whatever, and they could not tell you confidently whether it is moving the needle on anything that matters to the business. And it's important to think about how we frame this in the report. That impact or lack thereof gets compounded because Agile marketers aren't just aligning to goals that were set without them in the room. Remember that they helped shape those goals in the first place. So when they say their daily work connects to strategic objectives, there is a feedback loop there that does not exist for our alignment-only non-Agile crowd. You built the goals. Your work is designed to hit the goals. You understand why the goals matter. That is a completely different psychological and operational experience from we got handed a strategy in January, and now we're going to figure out how our campaign calendar needs to map to it. And BT dubs, this really matters for retention. It matters for burnout. I mean, one of the most demoralizing experiences in marketing, which we have all lived through, is working stupidly hard on something that you suspect does not actually matter. Hitting every deadline, shipping everything on plan, and still having zero sense that any of it makes a difference sucks. And Agile doesn't fix that lack of meaning just by existing. You're not going to Agile your way out of that. It's the structural mechanisms, the goal setting, the outcome tracking, the regular retrospection. Those things give people the actual evidence they need that their work connects to something real. That is not soft, squishy, irrelevant stuff. That is how you keep great people that you need to be competitive in 2026. Okay, I want to spend a few more minutes on the Teresa Torres angle before we wrap, because I think it's a genuinely useful reframe that doesn't get talked about enough in marketing and not just another borrowed idea from product. So her core argument in continuous discovery habits is that product teams shouldn't do discovery just as like a phase that happens before development. They should be doing it constantly. Weekly conversations with customers, small assumption tests, building and revising an opportunity tree that maps from desired outcomes to possible opportunities to specific solutions. Now, if you think about this, I think it maps really cleanly to marketing strategy, because the way that most marketing teams approach strategy is the same way that bad product teams approach discovery, as a thing that happens really rarely, once a year, on a deadline, resulting in this static document that we then just put in a drawer or in a folder on our desktop and never open again. The annual marketing strategy, the H1 roadmap, the Q3 plan. They are stale, static artifacts. They are not living intelligence. They're just snapshots of what we thought that one time that we had that conversation. And by the time we are executing against them 3, 6, 12 months later, the world is a completely different place. The needs and opportunities around our market and our customer base have changed dramatically. Agile planning mechanics help with the iteration part because we're updating plans monthly, adjusting priorities really regularly. I mean, in our report this year, 89% of Agile marketers update their plans at least monthly, compared to 66% of non-Agile teams. That is a meaningful gap. But the continuous discovery frame pushes things even further, because it asks, are we running a systematic process for understanding what opportunities exist in the first place before we start mapping out campaigns? What would this actually look like if you did this on your marketing team? I think probably a few things would start to change. Maybe you would establish some kind of standing customer interview cadence, not one big giant research project that you manage to squeeze in once a year, but a regular habit. Maybe you build a documented opportunity tree that maps from a business outcome to a market opportunity to a hypothesis about how marketing can help address those things. Maybe you have sprint reviews that don't just celebrate shipped work, but explicitly evaluate whether that work tested and validated an underlying assumption about how we're creating value for customers and prospects. This is how we start to see and feel the difference between we execute plans and we build strategic intelligence. The former is a production service function. The latter gets a seat in the room when next year's strategy is being written. So now I want to get to the part that most Agile content sort of diplomatically glosses over. Non-Agile teams are not less strategic because they lack talent or drive, or they don't care. They're less strategic because their operating model does not create the conditions for strategic contribution. They have to white knuckle it in, try extra, extra hard to make it happen. Whereas Agile teams make it happen just naturally through their ways of working. So think about what life looks like on a purely reactive marketing team. Maybe you live this day to day, in which case I'm sorry for you. You're context switching constantly. You might be on 4 or 5 or 20 active campaigns or projects at any given moment. There is no slack in the system. So when a new request comes in from sales or a business unit leader or executives, it goes on top of everything else that's already in flight because there's no prioritized backlog, there's no protected sprint, there's no explicit this is what we are not doing, so we can do this. In that environment, protected strategic thinking time, it does not exist. Not because nobody values it or wants it, but because there is no structural mechanism to make it happen. Every hour that you spend thinking about where the market is going or having conversation with customers is an hour you're quote unquote not being productive. The incentive in those kinds of reactive environments is to always be seen as executing on something. And this is what I mean when I say you can't sprint your way out of a strategy problem. Agile execution without any structural changes to how your team operates and how your team relates to leadership is not automatically going to unlock strategic influence. You can have beautifully, impeccably run sprints and still be a production function. What changes the equation is when the Agile operating model is used to renegotiate the terms of how marketing engages with the organization. So it's not just we work more efficiently now, but here's how we think about planning. Here's the evidence, the customer-focused data that we and only we can bring to the strategy conversation. Here's the structured cadence through which we will continually surface what we are learning. That is a completely different ask, and it requires leadership buy-in, not just team-level practice change. 82% of Agile marketers are confident that their planning habits keep them focused on what's important. 59% of non-Agile marketers say the same. That confidence gap is telling us something about what it feels like to operate inside a structured system versus a non-structured one. It is not just about outcomes, it's about clarity. And clarity is what makes strategic contribution possible. So, if you are listening to this and thinking, yes, that is our problem, here is how I would think about actually starting to work on it. I don't think in this case that a full-on transformation is where you need to go. There is a sequence of steps that's going to start getting this dealt with. First, you got to audit where your team actually sits on the spectrum. Not where you think you sit, not where you'd like to sit. Go look at your last 2 planning cycles. How much of your team's input shaped what went into the strategy? Not just how you executed it, but what the goals actually were. If the honest answer is, we got handed some goals and told to build stuff, that's your baseline. So don't skip this step, even if you know it's going to be unpleasant. You cannot close a gap that you have not first measured honestly. Once you've done that, your second step is to get structured about continuous discovery before you start worrying about strategic influence. You cannot walk into a planning conversation and claim strategic credibility without some strategic intelligence. So what does your team know about your customers right now? Not from a survey that you ran 18 months ago, but from regular, ongoing contact. Again, honest answers. If it's not much, all right, first gap to close. Even a monthly customer conversation with some kind of structured format is going to build more real market intelligence in a quarter than any annual research project could produce for you. Third, make a specific ask for protected time and bring data to justify it. Don't just make a vague ask for space to think strategically, because it's going to sound like code for we want to work less. You got to ask for a specific protected time block, even if it's just an hour a week per person, which is going to be dedicated to reviewing market signals, testing assumptions, and updating your opportunity map, which should be a publicly available document that people can follow along with your activities. You got to frame this as an investment in the quality of the strategic input that your team will then bring to the organization. And then you got to actually use it that way. If you ask for protected strategic thinking time, you better use it for strategic thinking. Do not let it get sucked up in execution minutia. You use it for strategic thinking, or you will never get another ask met ever again. Fourth, you got to change what you bring to planning conversations. Most marketing teams are showing up to these kinds of discussions with their campaigns, which is all right, I guess. But agile marketing teams should be showing up with hypotheses. Here is what we believe about the market based on our customer conversations. Here's the evidence we have, and here's how we want to test it. That shift from here's our preset plan to here's our intelligence and our recommended experiments, which we will confidently execute and report back on the outcomes of, that is what actually changes how leadership perceives the marketing function. And let's be real, none of this is going to happen in one sprint. You are talking about quarters of work here. But each of those 4 things that I just gave you is something that you could start on in the next 30 days. So no excuses on not working on your strategy problem if that is the thing that is holding you back. But better execution of your sprints is not the thing that's going to fix it. So if that feels like a lot and you could use a partner in getting this done, you know where to find me and the AgileSherpas team. Hit us up at AgileSherpas.com. We can help you build a plan. We can help you build a roadmap. We can sit beside you as you try to climb this mountain. We have done it before, and we can help you do it this time. Until next time, I'm Andrea Fryrear. And remember, the struggle is real, but so is Agile marketing.